You had a thought today, quiet, automatic, completely uninvited, that you've had 1,000 times before. Maybe it arrived while you were getting dressed. Maybe it whispered while you were pouring coffee. Maybe it surfaced the moment you opened your banking app or caught your reflection or thought about the person who hasn't called. You didn't choose the thought. You didn't summon it. It just appeared, carrying the same familiar weight it always carries. And before you even recognized what was happening, you were already inside it, already feeling it, already living in the reality it generates. And then, because you've read the books, because you've done the inner work, because you know better, you tried to think your way out of it. You caught the thought. You labeled it. You told yourself it wasn't true. You countered it with an affirmation, maybe two. You reminded yourself of your worth, your potential, your power. And for a moment, maybe 30 seconds, maybe a full minute, the counter thought held. Then the original impression came back, heavier, quieter, more certain of itself than anything you constructed to oppose it. And you felt that familiar sinking, that private defeat that nobody sees. And you moved on with your day carrying the same invisible weight you've been carrying for years. Neville Goddard would tell you that what just happened wasn't a failure of willpower. It wasn't a sign that you need better affirmations, or stronger discipline or more self-awareness. It was a demonstration, precise, mechanical, undeniable, of a fundamental truth about how your mind operates. A truth that, once you actually understand it, will explain why every analytical tool you've ever aimed at your deepest blocks has bounced off them like rain off stone. The truth is this: the part of your mind that generates the block and the part of your mind you've been using to remove it are two entirely different systems. They don't share a language. They don't share a logic. They don't even share a doorway. And every moment you spend trying to think, reason, analyze, or affirm your way through a subconscious impression, you are standing in one room shouting instructions through a wall at a room that cannot hear you. The wall isn't thin. There is no crack in it. Shouting louder doesn't help. Shouting smarter doesn't help. The only thing that helps is finding the actual entrance to the room where the block lives and walking through it. Today I'm going to show you the precise reason. Conscious thinking cannot access or alter subconscious programming, the 4 layers of subconscious impression that keep your blocks locked in place no matter how much you understand them, and the method Goddard taught for entering the subconscious directly and rewriting the impressions that have been running your life since before you knew they existed. Goddard's framework begins with a distinction so fundamental that missing it renders every other technique useless. He identified 2 levels of mind, not as metaphor, not as approximation, but as functionally separate operating systems with different inputs, different languages, and different outputs. The conscious mind is the reasoning faculty. It analyzes, categorizes, argues, affirms, decides. It's the part of you reading these words right now, evaluating them, comparing them to what you already know. The subconscious mind is the creative faculty. It doesn't reason. It doesn't evaluate. It receives impressions and builds reality from them with mechanical precision. Every circumstance in your life, your relationships, your finances, your health, your recurring patterns, is being generated right now by impressions held in the subconscious, not by what you think about those circumstances, by what's been impressed beneath your thinking. This distinction sounds academic until you see its consequences. The consequence is this: the entire personal development industry, the affirmations, the cognitive reframing, the belief work, the journaling, the analytical therapy that helps you understand where your patterns originated, all of it operates exclusively at the conscious level, every bit of it, and the blocks generating your stuck life don't live at the conscious level. They live beneath it. In a system that doesn't respond to words, doesn't respond to logic, doesn't respond to understanding, and has never once in your entire life changed because you figured out where it came from. Goddard was blunt about this. He watched student after student arrive at his lectures with extraordinary self-knowledge. They could name their blocks. They could trace them to specific childhood moments. They could articulate the exact belief running beneath their patterns. And they were completely, utterly stuck. Because knowing what program is running is not the same as changing the program. Knowing you have a block is a conscious activity. Dissolving the block requires subconscious access, and conscious knowing doesn't grant subconscious access any more than reading about swimming grants the ability to breathe underwater. This is where Goddard departed from everything else being taught, then and now. He didn't ask people to understand their blocks. He didn't ask them to trace the origin story. He didn't ask them to argue with the limiting belief or paste a better one on top. He said something far more radical. He said, stop trying to remove the block entirely. Stop engaging with it at the level of thought. Instead, impress a new assumption directly onto the subconscious through the only channels it actually receives, and let the new impression replace the old one the way a new path through a field replaces an old one. Not by destroying the old path, by walking a different one so consistently that the old one disappears under new growth. But before you can impress anything new, you need to understand why the old impressions are so resistant to everything you've been throwing at them. Goddard identified 4 layers of subconscious impression that, together, create a block so deeply embedded that no amount of surface-level work can dislodge it. Understanding these layers isn't about analysis. It's about recognizing exactly what you're up against, so you stop bringing a flashlight to a problem that requires a different kind of light altogether. The first layer is emotional encoding. Subconscious impressions aren't stored as thoughts. They're stored as feelings. When you were young, before you had the cognitive framework to reason about experience, events happened that carried intense emotional charge. A parent's withdrawal, a moment of humiliation, a sudden loss, a repeated message that you weren't enough. These events didn't enter your mind as concepts you could later debate. They entered as raw emotional impressions, clusters of feeling that your subconscious filed as permanent truths about reality. This is why you can know, consciously, that you deserve love, and still feel, beneath every relationship, that you're about to be abandoned. The knowing lives in the conscious mind. The feeling lives in the subconscious. And the feeling was encoded first, encoded deeper, and encoded in a language the conscious mind doesn't speak. You can argue with a thought. You cannot argue with a feeling that was installed before you had language. Goddard observed that people who tried to overcome subconscious blocks through intellectual understanding were essentially trying to delete a file by renaming it. The file is still there. The code is still running. You've just given it a new label. The person who says, "I've worked through my abandonment issues," but still chooses unavailable partners hasn't changed the subconscious impression. They've built a conscious narrative around it. The narrative lives upstairs. The impression lives in the basement. And the basement is where reality gets built. The second layer is repetitive reinforcement. Subconscious impressions don't just get installed once. They get reinforced daily by your habitual inner conversations, your automatic emotional reactions, your reflexive interpretation of events. Every time you check your bank account and feel that familiar contraction of scarcity, you're reinforcing the impression. Every time you imagine a conversation going wrong before it happens, you're reinforcing the impression. Every time you scan your life first thing in the morning and silently conclude that nothing has changed, you're reinforcing the impression. This is the part most people don't see. They think the block was installed in childhood and has been sitting there passively ever since, waiting to be removed. But the block isn't passive. It's being actively maintained by you through thousands of small, unconscious imaginal acts every single day. The worry you rehearsed in the shower this morning was a reinforcement. The inner conversation you had about money during your commute was a reinforcement. The flash of jealousy you felt scrolling through someone else's success was a reinforcement. Each one individually seems like nothing. Collectively, they constitute a construction project, building and rebuilding the same reality day after day with materials you didn't even notice you were carrying. Goddard was emphatic about this. He said most people are spending 16 hours a day unconsciously reinforcing the very blocks they spend 20 minutes trying to dissolve during their morning practice. The math is brutal. 20 minutes of deliberate impression against 16 hours of habitual counter-impression doesn't just fail. It can't succeed. The subconscious responds to frequency and intensity of impression. And the habitual impressions win on both counts because they carry genuine feeling and they run all day without supervision. The third layer is identity fusion. Over time, a subconscious impression doesn't just influence your behavior, it becomes your sense of self. The impression of unworthiness doesn't feel like a belief you hold. It feels like who you are. The impression of scarcity doesn't feel like a pattern you're running. It feels like reality itself. The fusion is so complete that questioning the impression feels like questioning your own existence. This is why challenging limiting beliefs often creates such intense resistance. You're not challenging an idea, you're challenging someone's identity when you tell someone running a deep unworthiness impression that they deserve abundance. Something inside them recoils, not because the statement is illogical, but because it contradicts who they experience themselves to be at the most fundamental level. The conscious mind might agree. The subconscious, which has been generating the experience of not enough for decades, treats the statement as a foreign object and rejects it. Goddard understood that this identity fusion is the real reason blocks persist. People aren't stuck because they lack information or willpower. They're stuck because the block has become inseparable from their sense of self. And you can't remove something you've identified as yourself using the same mind that made the identification. This is why Goddard never told people to remove blocks. He told them to assume a new state, a completely different identity, and to occupy it so thoroughly that the old identity loses its footing. You don't fix the old self, you move into a new one. The fourth layer is environmental confirmation. Once a subconscious impression is running, it generates circumstances that confirm it. The impression of unworthiness attracts, or more precisely, creates, situations that validate the feeling of being unworthy. The impression of scarcity produces financial circumstances that confirm scarcity. And then those external circumstances become evidence that the impression is true, which deepens the impression, which generates more confirming circumstances. It's a closed loop. The impression creates the evidence. The evidence reinforces the impression. And the person caught in the loop genuinely cannot tell which came first because, from inside, it feels like reality is proving the belief true. Goddard called the physical world a mirror. It reflects back whatever state you're occupying. But most people look in the mirror and conclude that the reflection is the cause. They think the circumstances created the feeling. They think the empty bank account causes the scarcity impression. They think the failed relationships cause the unworthiness. And so they try to change the reflection, hustling for more money, searching for better partners, rearranging external circumstances, while the impression that generated those circumstances continues running untouched. This is the four-layer trap. Emotional encoding makes the impression feel true. Repetitive reinforcement keeps it active. Identity fusion makes it feel permanent. Environmental confirmation makes it look proven. And against this four-layer fortress, you've been sending affirmations. Conscious, word-based, surface-level affirmations aimed at a system that was built by feeling, maintained by repetition, fused with identity, and confirmed by the physical world it generated. Now you understand why thinking doesn't work. Not because thinking is bad, because thinking is the wrong tool for this job. You've been using a screwdriver on a nail. The screwdriver is a perfectly good tool. The nail doesn't respond to it. The subconscious is the nail. Thinking is the screwdriver. You need a hammer. And Goddard spent his career describing exactly what that hammer is and how to swing it. The hammer has 3 components. Miss any one of them and you're back to the screwdriver. The first component is the drowsy state. Goddard identified a specific window, the moments between full waking consciousness and sleep, where the conscious mind's filtering mechanism naturally relaxes. During waking hours, your rational mind acts as a bouncer. Every impression that tries to enter the subconscious gets screened. If it contradicts the existing programming, it gets rejected. This is why affirmations bounce off. The bouncer hears, "I am wealthy," checks it against the existing impression of scarcity, and turns it away at the door. But in the drowsy state, the bouncer steps aside. Your critical faculty softens. The analytical mind loosens its grip. And whatever you hold in imagination during this window passes through to the subconscious without resistance. This isn't mysticism. It's the natural architecture of the mind. The transition between waking and sleeping has always been a period of heightened suggestibility. Every hypnotherapist, every sleep researcher, every meditation tradition that works with liminal states understands this. Goddard simply recognized that this window is the entry point you've been missing, the door to the room where the blocks actually live. Most people don't just waste this window. They weaponize it against themselves. They lie in bed running worst-case scenarios. They replay the day's conflicts with full emotional intensity. They scroll through content that generates anxiety and comparison. They fall asleep inside the very feelings they've been trying to escape during the day. And the subconscious, which is wide open during this window, receiving every impression without filtration, accepts all of it as instruction. Every fearful scene rehearsed before sleep becomes programming. Every worried conversation replayed becomes a blueprint. You've been handing the subconscious its nightly instructions without knowing it. And those instructions have been building tomorrow's reality while you slept. Goddard's first instruction was devastatingly simple. Use the window deliberately. As you feel yourself beginning to drift, stop whatever habitual imagining you've been doing. Construct a scene, short, specific, sensory, that implies your desired reality is already fulfilled. Hold it, loop it, feel it as real, and let the drowsy state carry it past the bouncer, through the door, and directly into the subconscious, where it becomes new programming. The second component is sensory immersion. The subconscious doesn't receive language. It doesn't process logic. It receives experience, felt, sensory, vivid, first-person experience. This is why affirmations fail even when repeated in the drowsy state. Saying words even drowsily is still a linguistic operation. The subconscious doesn't speak that language. What it speaks is sensation, touch, sound, temperature, weight, texture. The specific visual detail seen through your own eyes, not watched from the outside. Goddard taught that when you construct an imaginal scene with enough sensory detail, when you feel the handshake, hear the specific words of congratulation, sense the weight of the object in your hand, smell the room, taste the celebration. The subconscious cannot distinguish this experience from physical reality. Both register as real, both become impressions, both generate corresponding physical circumstances. This is what separates Goddard's approach from visualization as most people practice it. Most people visualize like watching a movie, observing a pleasant scene from outside, appreciating the image, maybe generating some excitement about it. But the subconscious isn't in the audience. The subconscious responds to experience, not observation. You need to be inside the scene, looking through your own eyes, feeling with your own hands, hearing sounds arriving at your own ears. The shift from watching to being is the shift from entertainment to creation, and it's non-negotiable. Goddard pushed this further. He said the single most important sense to engage isn't sight, it's touch. Touch is the most intimate, most grounding, most real sense you have. You can distrust what you see. You can question what you hear. But what you feel under your fingertips carries an authority the other senses can't match. So when you construct your scene, make touch the anchor, the texture of the fabric, the coolness of the metal, the warmth of someone's hand, the sensation of your feet on a specific floor. Build the scene around what you touch, and the other senses will organize themselves around that tactile reality. The third component is the feeling of fulfillment. This is where everything comes together, and where nearly everyone goes wrong. The sensory scene must be accompanied by a specific emotional state. Not excitement, not hope, not the thrill of getting something new. The quiet, settled, unremarkable feeling of already having it. Think about something you already possess, something you once desperately wanted but now take completely for granted. Your home, your phone, a skill you've mastered. Notice the feeling. There isn't one. That's the point. Things that are real don't generate emotional fireworks. They generate normalcy. And normalcy is the emotional signature the subconscious reads as, "This is the current state of reality. Execute accordingly." When Goddard told his students to assume the feeling of the wish fulfilled, most of them immediately tried to generate excitement or gratitude or high vibrational emotion, and Goddard would correct them. He'd say, "What does it feel like on an ordinary Wednesday afternoon 6 months after you already have this? Not the day you received it, not the celebration. A random, boring, unremarkable afternoon when having this thing is just your life. That feeling, that total absence of wanting, is what you need to generate and carry into sleep. The absence of wanting is the key that unlocks everything. Because wanting is the experience of not having. And the subconscious, which builds reality to match your dominant inner experience, cannot produce having from the state of wanting. It can only produce more wanting, more reaching, more almost, but not quite. The moment you shift from wanting to having, from anticipation to normalcy, the subconscious receives an entirely different instruction, and it builds accordingly. Now, here's what makes these three components, the drowsy state, sensory immersion, and the feeling of fulfillment, so fundamentally different from thinking your way out of a block. When you think about a block, you engage the conscious mind. You stay in the room where the block doesn't live. You manipulate words and concepts that the subconscious doesn't process, and the block continues generating your reality completely untouched by your efforts. But when you enter the drowsy state with a sensory scene saturated in the feeling of already having, you bypass the conscious mind entirely. You walk through the door the bouncer left unguarded. You enter the room where the block actually lives, and instead of trying to remove the block, which would require engaging it, which would require thinking about it, which would pull you back to the conscious level, you simply impress a new assumption right beside it, and then you do it again the next night, and the next, and the next. Goddard compared this process to a garden. You don't remove weeds by staring at them and understanding their root systems. You plant what you want to grow and you tend it until it overtakes the weeds. The weeds don't disappear because you fought them. They disappear because the garden filled with something else. The block in your subconscious doesn't dissolve because you understood it, analyzed it, or argued with it. It loses its power because you impressed something new with enough feeling and repetition that the subconscious began building from the new impression instead of the old one. This is also why Goddard taught revision, the practice of entering past memories in imagination and replaying them as you wish they had occurred. The original memory is an active subconscious impression. It's not a dead file sitting in storage. It's running right now, generating present tense effects. When you revise the memory, entering it in the drowsy state, experiencing the revised version with full sensory detail and the feeling that this is how it actually happened, you're not denying reality. You're overwriting the impression. You're giving the subconscious a different script for that chapter. And as the revised impression deepens through repetition, the effects of the original memory begin changing in your present circumstances. Students who practiced revision consistently reported something Goddard found repeatedly. Relationships with people from revised memories shifted, without the other person being contacted or told anything. Patterns that traced directly back to the original event stopped recurring. Physical symptoms connected to old emotional trauma eased. It was as if the subconscious, having accepted the revision, stopped generating a present reality based on the original wound and started generating one based on the healed version. This shouldn't surprise anyone who understands the mechanism. If the subconscious builds reality from impressions, and you change the impression, Reality must change. It's not optional. It's not dependent on the other person cooperating or the circumstances aligning. The subconscious doesn't check whether the impression matches external facts. It builds from whatever impression is dominant. Make the revised impression dominant through repetition in the drowsy state, and the subconscious has no choice but to build from it. But here's where Goddard's teaching becomes most demanding, and where most people silently quit. The nightly session is not the whole practice. It's the beginning. The real work happens during the day, because the block you're replacing doesn't just run at night. It runs every waking moment through your habitual inner conversations, your automatic emotional reactions, and your reflexive interpretations of events. If you impress the feeling of abundance for 10 minutes before sleep, and then spend the next 16 hours impressing scarcity through worry, comparison, and financial anxiety, the 16 hours will overpower the 10 minutes. Every time. Goddard was unflinching about this. He said the daytime discipline is harder than the nightly practice by an order of magnitude. The nightly practice requires 10 minutes of focused imagination. The daytime discipline requires constant vigilance over your inner world, catching every inner conversation that contradicts your new impression and redirecting it. Not fighting it, not analyzing it, redirecting it. Returning to the feeling of the wish fulfilled. Briefly, quietly, without drama. Just a return, and then another return, and another. Dozens of times a day, hundreds of times a week, until the new feeling becomes more habitual than the old one. He described it as changing the course of a river. You don't stop the water, you redirect it. At first, the old channel is so deep that the water keeps flowing back to it. But every time you redirect, the new channel gets a little deeper and the old one gets a little shallower. Eventually, not overnight, not in a week, but inevitably, the new channel becomes the path of least resistance. The water flows there naturally, the old channel dries up, and your reality, which was being generated by the old flow, begins reflecting the new one. This is what people miss when they say Goddard's methods don't work. They used the nightly technique for 2 weeks, saw no physical change, and concluded the mechanism was broken. But the mechanism wasn't broken. It was working perfectly. Processing the 2 weeks of nightly impression alongside the 2 weeks of daytime counter-impression and producing a reality that reflected the dominant signal, which was still the old one. Because 2 weeks of nightly sessions cannot overpower years of daytime reinforcement unless the daytime work is happening too. Goddard never minimized how hard this is. He acknowledged that your habitual inner world has been running unsupervised for decades. It has grooves worn so deep that redirecting feels unnatural, exhausting, sometimes impossible. He said most people who hear this teaching will try it briefly, find the daytime discipline too demanding, and return to the comfortable familiarity of their old inner conversations, which will continue building the same reality they've always built. He wasn't cynical about this. He was honest. The mechanism is available to everyone. The discipline is sustained by few. But he also said something encouraging that his students found deeply motivating. The deliberate impression is more powerful per instance than the habitual one. When you consciously enter the drowsy state, construct a vivid sensory scene, and saturate it with the feeling of fulfillment, that single act carries more creative weight than hours of distracted, low-intensity habitual worrying. Not because magic, because the deliberate act engages the subconscious at peak receptivity with focused intensity. The habitual worry operates at low intensity across many hours. Concentrated force applied precisely outperforms diffused force applied broadly. This is why transformation through Goddard's method takes months, not decades. What took a lifetime to install unconsciously can be overwritten in a fraction of the time, provided you bring the same consistency to the new impression that life brought to the old one. Here's what Goddard ultimately understood about subconscious blocks that makes his approach categorically different from every other method available. The block is not the enemy. The block is not a problem to solve. The block is an old impression that served some purpose when it was installed, usually protection, usually in childhood, and has continued operating faithfully ever since because no one ever gave the subconscious a different instruction in a language it could understand. You don't wage war against the block. You don't analyze it into submission. You don't shout affirmations at it from across the wall. You simply move. You enter the drowsy state. You construct the scene. You feel the fulfillment. You impress the new assumption. And you do it again tomorrow night. And you spend tomorrow's daytime redirecting every inner conversation that tries to drag you back. And you do that the next day and the next. The block doesn't shatter. It fades, like a path through a field that nobody walks anymore. The grass grows over it, not because you tore the path up, because you stopped walking it and started walking somewhere else. The subconscious, which has been faithfully executing the old impression, begins executing the new one, not because you forced it, but because the new impression became more vivid, more frequent, more emotionally saturated than the old one. And the subconscious always builds from whatever impression is dominant. This is the shift Goddard offered, from fighting with the conscious mind to communicating with the subconscious in its own language, from understanding your blocks to impressing past them, from analyzing the blueprint of the life you don't want to drafting the blueprint of the life you do, and handing it to the only part of your mind that actually builds. Your blocks are not permanent features of who you are. They're impressions. That's all. Impressions made by experiences you didn't choose, reinforced by habits you didn't examine, fused with an identity you didn't consciously construct. And impressions can be overwritten, not through thought, through the precise application of feeling, imagery, and repetition, delivered through the one doorway the subconscious leaves open every night of your life. You've spent years trying to think your way through a wall that thinking cannot penetrate. Tonight you can walk through the door that's been there the entire time, not by understanding the block, not by naming it, tracing it, or arguing with it, by lying down, letting the drowsy state take you, entering a scene so vivid you can feel it under your hands, feeling the settled normalcy of already having what you desire and falling asleep inside that feeling while the subconscious receives it as the newest, clearest, most emotionally saturated instruction it's been given in years. Do that tonight. Do it tomorrow night. Do it until the feeling of having becomes more familiar than the feeling of wanting. And during the day, every time the old inner conversation starts running, redirect. Return to the feeling, briefly, quietly, without fighting what arose, just a return, over and over, until the new channel is deeper than the old one and the water flows there on its own. That's what Goddard taught. Not a philosophy, a practice, not a belief to adopt, a mechanism to operate. The blocks you've been trying to think your way through were never going to yield to thought. They yield to impression. The right kind, delivered through the right channel with the right feeling, repeated with the right consistency. You now know where the door is. You now know what language the subconscious speaks. Everything that happens from here is a function of whether you use what you know, not once, not as a test, but as the nightly discipline through which your inner world is rebuilt, and your outer world has no choice but to follow.